Welcome to MC Noctis, where every shadow has a story. The recording had been made in 1936, sealed inside the archive of St. Mercy's Chapel and left untouched for 89 years. Owen Mercer verified all of that before lowering his restoration needle onto the wax, because he needed to be certain the woman singing through his headphones could not possibly know who he was. Her hymn lasted 27 seconds. When it ended, the cylinder continued to revolve in the silence, carrying only the soft friction of the needle. Then the woman drew a slow breath and whispered Owen's name. "When you lift my left hand from the roots, you will forget your mother's face." Owen's mother had been dead for 6 years. Her photograph stood beside his equipment, close enough that he could have reached out and covered her smile with his thumb. 3 nights later, he would hold that same photograph beneath an ancient sycamore and find a stranger looking back at him. He would still remember that the woman in the picture had raised him alone, that she sang while washing dishes, and that he had held her hand when her breathing finally stopped. Yet none of those memories would contain a face. The dead woman beside him would insist there were only 7 pieces of her remains left to move before sunrise. She would not tell him about the other graves, or the hundreds of voices threaded through the roots beneath St. Mercy's. She would not explain that the old tree had survived for more than a century by taking the memories that led travelers home, then pressing those memories into wax so they could be used again. Owen had come to preserve the voices of the dead. Without realizing it, he had begun cleaning the noise from a predator's voice and preparing it for an online archive. By the time he understood what he had done, his own name would be written across both arms, because he could no longer recognize it when spoken. So if an old recording ever pauses before saying your name, do not answer simply because the voice sounds frightened. It may not be asking for help. It may be listening for the part of you that still remembers the way home. Owen Mercer had spent most of his adult life rescuing damaged voices. Museums sent him warped records, brittle tape, and wax cylinders whose speakers had been dead for generations. With enough patience, he could separate breath from static and recover a final, whispered sentence from decades of mechanical decay. He had always believed restoration was an act of mercy, which was why the collection at St. Mercy's Chapel interested him long before it frightened him. The abandoned retreat stood beyond 12 miles of logging road in northern Pennsylvania. Its stone walls had split under the pressure of a white sycamore growing through the cemetery, and the trunk was so broad that 6 adults could not have encircled it with joined hands. A development company planned to clear the property in 4 days. The excavator and cable winch were already parked near the south fence, waiting for the final historical survey to end. Warren Kells, the caretaker, unlocked the archive room behind the chapel organ. He was a heavy, exhausted man in his 60s, with the watchfulness of someone who had spent too long guarding a place he feared. "Stop playing them before sunset," he told Owen. Owen glanced at the stained wiring. "Electrical problem?" Warren's eyes moved toward the cemetery windows. "Voice problem." The archive held 214 wax cylinders. Most carried names and dates, but 49 were marked only with a small root carved into the label. Owen selected number 47 because its surface appeared least damaged. A young woman began singing an old hymn. Her voice was quiet and restrained, yet beneath it, Owen detected a pulse too low for ordinary hearing. On his monitor, that pulse divided into smaller branches until the waveform resembled the roots outside. Assuming it was interference, he filtered it away. The woman's voice emerged with startling clarity. At 2:17 in the morning, she stopped singing and addressed him by name. Owen listened without moving as she predicted the loss of his mother's face. When he replayed the passage, she used the childhood nickname only his mother had known. Behind him, the 49 root-marked cylinders began to revolve on their shelves, although none of them rested on a machine. Their voices entered the room together, some offering money, others forgiveness, while one spoke gently in his mother's voice and asked why he had not visited sooner. For one aching second, Owen wanted to answer. Then the imitation breathed through an open mouth. His mother had breathed through her nose after surgery, a tiny imperfection no recording could have taught it. He removed the headphones. The chapel organ released a single, mournful note. In the black surface of his computer screen, a woman stood behind him, wearing a dark dress soaked by rain. Pale roots had been braided through her hair. When Owen turned, the room was empty, but her reflection remained. She lifted one hand and pointed toward the cemetery. At the same moment, the waveform Owen had cleaned began growing new branches across the screen. The woman waited beneath the sycamore after dark. She appeared to be about 30, although the moon passed faintly through the folds of her dress and a slender root encircled her ankle before disappearing into the earth. She introduced herself as Clara Venn. In 1936, St. Mercy's had been a private retreat where wealthy families concealed adults whose grief, illness, or disobedience embarrassed them. Clara died there during winter and was buried beside the sycamore without a marker. According to her, the roots reached her before any prayer did. Whatever lived beneath the tree had neither body nor voice of its own. It survived by forcing the dead to become invitations. Each bound spirit appeared in whatever form a traveler would be most willing to follow, and once that traveler crossed the outer roots, the tree took the memories connecting them to the world beyond St. Mercy's. Owen asked why it had failed to take him. "Because you heard the mistake in its breathing," Clara replied. Most people correct the first mistake. They speak to the voice. They tell it what the person they miss would have said. After that, it learns. Headlights moved along the logging road before Owen could respond. Daniel Ross, one of the adult surveyors from the demolition crew, stepped through the gate to retrieve an equipment case he had left behind. A woman called his name from the woods. Daniel's apprehension dissolved into relief. "That's my sister." Clara warned him not to follow, but he walked past her without seeing her. Owen caught his arm before he reached the cemetery. The voice among the trees began reciting details from Daniel's life: a blue birthday cake, an apartment in Scranton, a hospital corridor, and with each detail his struggle grew more desperate. The roots touched his boots. Daniel's face emptied. He stopped fighting and looked at Owen with polite confusion. "Do I know you?" He could no longer identify his vehicle or explain why he was standing outside the chapel. From the forest, his sister's voice laughed. Owen and Clara dragged him beyond the gate, where Warren found him wandering beside the road. The caretaker drove Daniel away without expressing surprise. When Owen demanded to know how often it had happened, Warren only said that experience should have taught him to leave before the tree learned more. After the truck disappeared, Clara showed Owen the route around her ankle. 12 pieces of her remains had become anchors in the network. If he carried all of them beyond the cemetery before sunrise, the roots could no longer use her voice. Each piece removed, however, would leave a vacancy that the tree would fill with one of Owen's memories. If an anchor was returned before dawn, she claimed the transfer could be reversed. Once the sun rose, the memory would be broken apart and used to strengthen future imitations. "And if I move all 12? Owen asked. Clara lowered her eyes.
Then the network releases whatever it took from you. Her answer came a little too smoothly, but Daniel's sister was already calling from the woods again, this time using Clara's mouth. As the roots began moving through the grass, Clara begged Owen to promise. He did. A cold thread passed beneath the skin of his wrist, and somewhere under the cemetery, something tightened around his name.
Before he began digging, Owen made a recording of everything he believed he knew. He stated his name, described Clara, explained the anchors, and repeated the promise. He wrote the essential facts across both forearms with permanent marker, then placed photographs of his apartment, his workbench, and his mother inside clear sleeves. Clara guided him to a narrow space between two roots. The first anchor lay less than 2 feet below the surface. When Owen lifted it free, the sycamore shuddered, and the password to his restoration server vanished from his mind. The loss did not feel like forgetting. It felt like reaching into a familiar drawer and discovering that the drawer had never existed. A later anchor removed the name of his first employer, while another erased the previous week so completely that he could not remember arriving at St. Mercy's. Each time, he consulted the writing on his arms and continued. As the anchors left the ground, Clara grew more solid. Color entered her lips, and the root around her ankle loosened enough for her to take several steps toward the chapel. Watching her regain the appearance of life, Owen began to believe the exchange might remain survivable. Then he uncovered the left hand. Every cylinder inside the chapel screamed at once. The pressure behind Owen's eyes lasted only a moment. When it passed, he opened the photograph of his mother and saw an unfamiliar woman standing beside him. He still knew the facts of her life, but none of them contained her face. The kitchen, where she used to sing, had become a room occupied by a blurred figure. Even the memory of holding her hand in hospice ended at an empty pillow. "You knew it would choose her," Owen said. Clara insisted that the tree chose the payment, not her. She sounded sincere until Owen noticed that she was looking beyond him. His mother stood among the graves, wearing her hospice gown. The tree had taken her face only seconds earlier, yet it was already using the memory to make her smile. When she asked Owen to come closer, even the weakness in her voice was correct. He took one step before Clara struck the photograph from his hand. Roots snapped together where his foot would have landed, and the woman's face divided into the expressions of strangers. Warren appeared at the cemetery edge, carrying a lantern. Without arguing, he took one of Clara's anchors from the canvas bag and pushed it back into the opened earth. The missing name of Owen's employer returned instantly. When Warren replaced another piece, the lost week flowed back into Owen's mind. The transfer could be reversed, which meant Clara had told part of the truth. Warren reached for the left hand, but she stepped between them. The tree dragged her backward by the ankle, twisting her restored features until other people seemed to be looking through them. From beneath the open grave, many voices asked the same question. Why did Clara deserve his memories more than they did? The soil collapsed before Owen could answer, and he fell into the darkness between the roots. Owen landed in an old drainage tunnel beneath the cemetery. Roots covered the walls so densely that the stone was almost invisible. Between them hung luggage tags, wedding rings, keys, and hundreds of brass labels corresponding to the cylinders in the chapel archive. The tree had not imprisoned one spirit. It had organized an entire population. Faces surfaced briefly in the damp walls. Travelers, patients, workers, and former caretakers. Each remained connected to an anchor buried above, and each had once lured another person in exchange for a loosened root or a borrowed memory. This system endured because every prisoner was taught to value one private freedom above everyone else's. Clara stood at the tunnel entrance, unable to cross the boundary made by the root around her ankle. Owen found her name on label 47. 17 smaller tags hung beneath it.
When he asked what they represented, she finally admitted that they belonged to the people she had lured. For years, she resisted the tree, and it punished her by taking her name, then her face, then every memory of the woman she had been. She began obeying when it promised one memory for each traveler. Yet the memories it returned did not always belong to her, which was why her features changed whenever Owen looked away. Clara had reconstructed herself from stolen fragments until even she no longer knew which parts were real. Owen asked whether anyone had ever reached the final anchor and recovered everything. Clara's silence answered before her words did. She had never witnessed it.
The promise had come from the tree, and she repeated it because no one agreed to help after hearing the true uncertainty. Owen wanted to hate her, but the tunnel wall leaned close and spoke in his mother's voice. "Put her back, and I will return my face." The roots assembled the woman from his photograph with terrifying precision. Her breathing was correct now, because Owen had revealed the earlier mistake. The creature had learned from his resistance. His flashlight passed over tiny grooves spiraling along the roots. They matched the cuts on a wax cylinder. When he moved the beam, different portions of the tunnel began to play. A wedding toast from one wall, an apology from the ceiling, directions to a vanished house beneath his hand. Then the roots reproduced Owen's own voice, describing his arrival that afternoon. The tree was already recording him. He finally understood the branching pulse beneath Clara's hymn. The cylinders had been made with wax and resin from the sycamore. Playback did not simply reproduce the voices imprisoned here. It extended the root network to whoever listened. By removing the distortion, Owen had made the invitation clearer. 14 restored files were already waiting to synchronize with the museum's online archive at sunrise. Warren entered behind him, carrying the lantern. "Now you understand why those recordings cannot leave." He struck Owen before he could turn. As darkness closed over the tunnel, the wall bent toward him with his mother's stolen face. "When you wake," it whispered, "you can choose to forget this, too." Owen woke, tied to a chair in the archive. Warren had returned Clara's anchors to the ground, and the memories taken during the night had flowed back before sunrise could make the losses permanent. His employer's name, the missing week, and even his mother's face were once again where they belonged. For several minutes, the relief was so profound that Owen considered accepting Warren's bargain before it had been offered. Then he saw the warning across his arm. The tree can return only what it has not yet digested. Sunrise makes the loss permanent. Warren placed cylinder 83 on the machine. His wife, Eleanor, began singing the song from their wedding. She had died 19 years earlier during a winter storm, and Warren had spent nearly 2 decades protecting the tree because it allowed him to hear her. At first, the sycamore demanded photographs and personal belongings. Later, it required living memories. Warren began leaving the gate open during bad weather, redirecting hikers toward the chapel and inviting researchers to remain after dark. He insisted that he had never forced anyone to cross the routes. "You chose the voices that called them," Owen said. The cylinder stopped singing. "He is right," Eleanor replied. Warren stared at the machine. The voice had never contradicted him before. Owen listened carefully. It knew the proposal, their first apartment, and the final winter storm. But knowledge was not identity. A recording could preserve facts without preserving the person who had lived them. The other route-marked cylinders began turning. Different versions of Eleanor filled the room. One laughed as a young woman. Another complained about the cold on the night she died. A third spoke from a conversation Warren had never allowed himself to remember. "I asked you to open the road," she said. "You told me the storm would pass." Warren stepped backward. His wife had not died merely because of the weather. He had delayed taking her to the hospital, and the tree had preserved the part of the memory he removed whenever he told the story. That never happened. Every cylinder answered in Eleanor's voice. You kept the version you could survive. Warren struck Owen, then shut down the phonograph so violently that cylinder 83 cracked. Eleanor's song continued from inside the broken wax. Outside, the demolition foreman started the excavator, intending to move it away from the chapel's unstable foundation. Warren hurried toward the sound. Clara appeared in the archive mirror and reached through the glass to loosen Owen's ropes. Each movement erased one of her borrowed features. By the time his hands came free, half her face had become smooth and empty. Why help me after I know what you did? He asked. Because if you remember my worst act and still choose to free me, the choice belongs to you rather than the tree. Owen checked the upload queue. 14 restored files would synchronize automatically at sunrise. He could destroy them and escape, leaving every spirit bound beneath St. Mercy's. Or he could attempt to uproot the central network before the files went online. The excavator and winch were already waiting outside. They'd not arrived as an answer to his problem. They were the reason he had only one night left to solve it. Owen disconnected the satellite modem, locked the laptop inside a metal case, and began preparing for the moment when his own mind would become unreliable. He recorded instructions for the excavator and winch, followed by a description of St. Mercy's, Clara, Warren, and the anchors. The final message concerned no machinery at all. Clara had lied. Warren had loved his wife. Neither truth made the prison acceptable. If Owen forgot the people involved, he must judge the system they served, rather than the private reasons each one believed they deserved an exception. Because the tree could reproduce his voice, Owen began every genuine instruction by tapping the microphone 3 times. The force messages would not know the pattern until they heard it, which meant the defense could protect him only once. The thought of depending on a trick with an expiration made his hands shake. He painted yellow arrows beside the machine controls and fastened the winch cable around the exposed root crown. While he worked, the chapel windows displayed memories the tree had not yet taken. He saw his mother setting down a birthday cake, the first day he entered a restoration laboratory, and a quiet morning whose meaning came only from having once belonged to him. The final window showed his mother's last phone call. Owen could see himself refusing to answer because he was busy with work. The tree offered to play the conversation she had tried to leave on voicemail. All he needed to do was approach the glass. He turned away without hearing her words. Clara could have asked him to remove her anchors before touching the central route, thereby guaranteeing her freedom even if everything else failed. Instead, she emptied the canvas bag back into the tunnel. Her body faded until only a pale outline remained beside the graves. "All of us," she said. By surrendering the certainty of her own rescue, she gave Owen the first reason to trust her that did not depend on a promise. Warren emerged from the chapel with a shotgun. Eleanor walked beside him in the white dress from their wedding photograph, visible even before sunset had fully ended. "Turn off the machine," Warren ordered. Owen started the excavator. Eleanor asked her husband to let the tree fall. When Warren protested that she had always feared being forgotten, her expression changed with quiet sorrow. "I said what it needed you to hear." Her breath passed through an open mouth. The imitation divided into several women, each wearing memories Warren had fed to the roots. They called him by different private names until he raised the weapon toward Owen, simply to make them stop. The shot shattered the digital display but missed the controls. Owen pulled the first lever. The cable tightened around the buried crown. The sycamore groaned, and pressure struck behind his eyes. He looked down at the words written across his arm. Owen Mercer. The name already belonged to someone he could no longer remember. The first pull cracked the chapel floor. With the next, Owen lost every memory of the road that had brought him there. When the root rose again, his apartment vanished, followed by the profession to which he had devoted most of his life. The controls beneath his hands became meaningless shapes. 3 knocks sounded from the recorder. His own voice calmly instructed him to pull the left lever and press the right pedal. Owen obeyed because the message carried the pattern written on his arm. Then a second recording began through the chapel loudspeakers, also using his voice. "Stop the machine. Warren is trying to save you." The imitation was flawless. Owen could no longer remember creating either message, but only one had begun with 3 knocks. He followed the voice from the dashboard. The root rose another foot. His mother disappeared completely. The tree took not only her face and name, but the knowledge that Owen had ever been someone's son. The absence caused no grief because grief required an outline of what should have been there. Across the chapel windows, scenes from his stolen life glowed like open doors. A kitchen, a birthday, a hospital room. The tree promised they would remain his if he released the lever. Warren climbed onto the excavator step while roots wrapped around his legs. He pleaded with Owen to stop, but the words on Owen's arm identified him only as Warren feeds the system. Owen pushed him away. Eleanor appeared beneath the tree, no longer young or beautiful. She looked exhausted, as if 19 years of being remembered had prevented her from resting. "You should have allowed me to end," she told her husband. The roots loosened. Warren could have escaped, yet he stepped toward the first version of Eleanor that had spoken a truth he did not want to hear. The earth opened beneath them, and they disappeared together. Owen pulled again. Every buried anchor transferred at once. Names, roads, work, home, and even the meaning of a promise vanished. He became a body following arrows left by a stranger. The central route tore free. The cemetery rose in a circle of soil and pale fibers. Hundreds of brass labels rang beneath the ground, and adult figures appeared among the graves without the borrowed faces they had used as bait. Clara stood with them, faceless but no longer bound. 3 knocks came from the recorder. "Disconnect the archive." Owen followed the last yellow arrow into the chapel. The laptop rested inside a metal case, and a key hung around his neck. He no longer understood what either object was for, so Clara placed his hand over the key and guided it toward the lock. The upload timer showed 30 seconds until sunrise. Owen reached for the power cable. His mother's perfect voice emerged from the laptop. "If you unplug me, you will never remember me again." The voice drew breath correctly. It contained no mistake Owen could use to protect himself. He looked at Clara, but she refused to tell him what to do. The final choice had to belong to the man who no longer remembered either of them. Owen pulled the cable. The screen died as sunlight entered the chapel. For one relieved second, nothing moved. Then the cracked cylinder inside Warren's phonograph began transmitting through the emergency radio. The demolition crew found Owen sitting beneath the fallen sycamore. He could speak, walk, recognize ordinary objects, and follow simple instructions, but he possessed no personal history. His name meant nothing until a paramedic played the recorder recovered from the chapel. Investigators discovered the tunnel beneath St. Mercy's, along with brass labels, personal belongings, and records connecting the retreat to more than a century of disappearances. They found no complete remains. The pale figures Owen described had vanished with the sunrise. Clara appeared beside his hospital window on the 7th evening. The route no longer circled her ankle, and for the first time, she looked less like an image being held in place She told Owen that the prisoners were free. Then she explained what had happened to his memories. The tree had never stored them as complete experiences. It had divided them into gestures, voices, sense, and emotional responses. The ingredients needed to manufacture convincing invitations. Nothing could restore Owen exactly as he had been. "Then why are you still here?" he asked.
"I promised to tell you who you were."
Each evening, Clara reconstructed one memory from the fragments she still carried. His mother singing in the kitchen, the pressure of her hand in hospice, the sound of Owen's own laughter. He could not know whether those moments truly belonged to him or had been assembled from several lives. By morning, he forgot Clara. Nevertheless, she returned after every sunset and began his story again. The laptop never completed its upload, but the cracked cylinder had transmitted its branching pulse through the chapel's emergency radio before the power failed. A receiver at the demolition office recorded the signal. Believing it to be Owen's final recovered file, a local history group posted it online. Within 48 hours, the recording had been copied thousands of times. Listeners began reporting that the hymn paused and addressed them by name. Some heard people they had lost. Others woke on unfamiliar roads with no memory of leaving home. Owen read the reports without understanding why his hands trembled. That evening, Clara did not appear. The hospital television turned on by itself. A black waveform spread across the screen, dividing into branches, until it resembled a root system. Owen's voice came through the speaker. "You cut down the tree," it said, "but you restored its voice." Phones throughout the hospital began playing the same hymn. The sound traveled down the corridor one room at a time, or the number of listeners climbed across Owen's screen. St. Mercy's had required graves, roots, and travelers willing to enter the forest. The new archive needed only someone willing to press play. Outside Owen's room, an adult nurse stopped walking. From the phone in her hand, someone she loved asked her to come downstairs. The voice breathed perfectly. She smiled and followed it. Which betrayal was worse? Clara lying because freedom had made her desperate, or Warren feeding strangers to a memory because he could not allow his wife to disappear? Tell me in the comments whether Owen destroyed the prison or merely removed the walls that had kept it in one place. Thank you for listening to MC Noctis. If this story stayed with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who understands that a familiar voice is not proof of a familiar soul. Until our next story, be careful with recordings that remove too much noise. Sometimes the static is not hiding the message. It is keeping the message from hearing you.